I'm going to talk about basically two things. So the success of the R2P and whether the R2P can be said to have had success or not, and some of the ongoing problems that I think that the doctrine faces, in particular the normative problems. Okay, so let me start with what I think about the R2P and the impact that it's had. Now, I think that the R2P has had some notable impact. More specifically, I think it helps to consider the direct and indirect impacts of the R2P. So in terms of the direct impacts, I think it's made a difference in Kenya, in Guinea, the Ivory Coast, and most obviously Libya, by discouraging violence against populations in these states. In each of these cases, the R2P might not have been the sole reason for action or even the primary reason for action by the international community, but I think it helped to prompt the international community to some extent to do something, even if not quite enough, and not always at the right moment. I also think the R2P's had an indirect impact. As we all know, there's been much rhetoric surrounding the R2P, and most states have agreed to the general principle that there is a responsibility to protect. Now, this agreement in principle, I think, is important. As Ed Luck, who's the UN Secretary General's Special Representative on the Responsibility to Protect, has recently argued, the principle needs to be adopted first before policy and tactical choices can be agreed. And to that extent, the fact that there has been this general agreement in the international community that there is this responsibility to protect principle is a key step. In addition, if you want to endorse a constructivist IR account, shared values and principles matter. They help to determine states' identities and what they see as in their own self-interest. So constructivists use the term the logic of appropriateness. And they say that the logic of appropriateness is key. So states aren't simply guided by consequences, they're also guided by what is viewed as appropriate behaviour in the international system. Now, the logic of appropriateness, I think, has shifted to some extent with the development of the R2P. Behaving in terms of the R2P, or at least framing one's behaviour in terms of the R2P, is seen as the most appropriate form of behaviour. Now, there are, of course, some acts and actors that go against this, as with all values and principles, but this doesn't necessarily belittle the legitimating import of the R2P. So, generally, if states want to be seen as good international citizens, they need to be seen as protecting human rights, they need to be seen as democratic, potentially concerned with human security, and increasingly, I think, be concerned with the responsibility to protect. And the framing language matters. So when states frame their behaviour in terms of the R2P, even if perhaps disingenuously doing so, rather than say, I don't know, other potential ways that they might frame their behaviour, say the war on terror, it limits the possibilities of what they can do. They need to at least pay lip service to the doctrine, and this rules out some potential things. Now, these indirect effects are very difficult to measure and very difficult to establish that the R2P has clearly had an effect. The direct ones are also fairly difficult to establish. Now, this brings me to a point about judging the success of the R2P. What's a reasonable standard by which to say that the R2P has actually had some impact? Now, I've got four basic thoughts on this. So, firstly, I think the only plausible way to judge the time frame is the R2P since 2005. So that's since the outcome document when states signed up to the outcome document in 2005 at the World Summit, rather than the 2001 report. So really there should be 6 candles on the cake of the R2P rather than the 10 that we're celebrating today. Second, I think it should be judged counterfactually. That is, by thinking what would have happened without the R2P's development, rather than, say, looking back to what the world was like in 2001, 2005. Perhaps without the R2P, some of the things that have been done might have been done with the doctrines of human security, with human rights, and the existing accounts of understandings of humanitarian intervention that were there before the R2P. But would, for instance, the Arab League have endorsed the intervention in Libya without the 2005 agreement and the general acceptance of the R2P and this kind of growing consensus surrounding the principle? Personally, I don't think so. Thirdly, I think the R2P should be measured according to the effects on individuals' basic human rights. And fourthly, I think we should ask what can be reasonably expected of such a doctrine. So rather than saying that the R2P hasn't been successful, hasn't achieved everything that the original ICISS commissioners wanted to achieve, we should consider what's been possible to achieve, and in that context, what's actually been achieved. So Alex Bellamy, I think, has persuasively argued that achieving agreement on criteria to govern when humanitarian intervention is going to be permissible was never going to be feasible given opposition in Washington, Beijing, Moscow and elsewhere. But saying that the R2P hasn't been successful because it hasn't led to some sort of agreement surrounding criteria for intervention, I think that's asking too much of it in terms of judging its success. Similarly, criticising the R2P for not addressing every single mass atrocity or for not always leading to robust and effective humanitarian intervention, I think is to set an unrealistic standard by which to judge the efficacy of the doctrine. So what I'm saying then is that we need to judge the success of the R2P according to whether, since 2005, it's made a reasonable improvement in the basic human rights compared to what would have been likely to happen without the doctrine. And I think if you adopt this measure of success, to me at least, it seems that it has had the direct and indirect impacts that I spoke about earlier. Of course, there's a lot more to be done, a lot of more improvements that could be made and things that could be better. Now, to that end, I want to now turn to some of the broader problems with the R2P. Now, much of the literature on the R2P focuses with some very specific issues with the doctrine. I want to consider some of the broader normative problems, putting on my more political theory hat. Now, these problems I don't think completely undermine the doctrine or necessarily the approach taken by Ed Luck, but I do think that they suggest that the R2P is at best a compromise to political reality and far from the best that we can hope for. Now, the first is the emphasis on prevention. So it's often said that the R2P, the main thing it offers is all about prevention. So prevention is often said the key aspect of the R2P. It's about preventing crises before they arise. Now, the problem with prevention is that it can actually be very intrusive. And to be fair, this has been noted by quite a few of the advocates. So Jennifer Welch has noted it, who can't be here, and Ed Luck has noted it, and Alex Bellamy. So, say if I said to you that I'll pressurise you to come into your house and put in place a whole host of fairly intrusive measures on the faint possibility of you hitting your partner at some point in the distant future, we might think that that's a problematic violation of your individual autonomy. And we might think the same about states. If we interfere with the state on the mere possibility of there being mass atrocities at some point in the distant future, we might think it a problematic violation of the individual autonomy of the citizens of that state. Now, the problem is this. The R2P's account of prevention is far more permissive than that defended in just war theory and in the standard accounts of the ethics of humanitarian intervention. Just war theory typically requires that there be some form of imminence before you can react. And humanitarian intervention typically says that a crisis has to be ongoing or impending. Now, the point made about these approaches is about certainty. it's normally said there needs to be a very high probability of some sort of major wrongdoing for intrusive action to be permissible, and this probability is established by imminence. But for the responsibility to prevent, a much lower degree of probability is required. And this, I think, could be potentially dangerous. Now, prevention becomes most problematic when we're concerned with the use of military force. So I could imagine a case in the future where the UN Security Council, or even the regional organisation, authorises morally dubious preventative action without there really actually being a proper humanitarian crisis to tackle, without there being a proper crisis, in order to weaken a state, or perhaps more likely, to prop up a weak regime that's popular with, say, the permanent members of the UN Security Council against the rebel movement. The second and broader problem, let me now turn to the second problem. So the second and broader problem is, I think, with the statism of the RTP. Now, in one sense, the RTP is still fundamentally about states and state sovereignty. So it's about helping states to look after their citizens and thereby meeting the standards of sovereignty as responsibility. So pillars 1 and 2 of the RTP in particular seem to be all about patching up states so that they can be sovereign. So the Secretary General's report in 2009 is called State Sovereignty, the bedrock of the RTP. Now, I think there are two problems here. The first is that it's somewhat a futile exercise. It's attempting to patch up a Westphalian system when we're increasingly moving beyond this. And second, to some extent, I think it's a morally problematic exercise, to the extent that non-state actors are delegitimized. If we're fundamentally concerned with looking after basic human rights, which the RTP purports, it may be that non-state actors and other forms of political arrangement and ways of conceiving of sovereignty, say rather than simply vertical, would be more suitable. So another way of putting this is that the RTP is a halfway house between statism and cosmopolitanism. And I think the tide and the ethical case are with the latter. Okay, the third and final issue that I'm going to consider is the limiting of the RTP to 4 crimes. So the RTP is limited to crimes of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Now, as has been claimed by many, such as Monica Serrano in a recent paper, the RTP's scope is unduly narrow in one sense, and that's the sense that many cases of the lesser violations of human rights, of civil and political rights, are excluded. But the scope is narrow in another sense, and that's its predominant focus on civil and political rights, rather than socioeconomic ones. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, like the philosopher Henry Shue, I think that any plausible account of basic human rights has to include socioeconomic rights. And so if we're concerned with the responsibility to protect basic human rights, which the R2P purports to be so, I think it would also have to be logically concerned with protecting socioeconomic rights as well. So Rock and Axworthy in a paper in 2009 ask, is there a moral difference between an innocent person being killed by a machete or by an AK-47 or starving to death or dying in a cholera epidemic that could have been avoided by a proper response to a humanitarian emergency? But I want to argue more strongly than that. In fact, I think there's reason to focus more on socioeconomic rights. And this is because of the issue of saving the greatest number. So philosophers tend to agree that when there's a forced choice between saving 2 sets of people, numbers matter, and you should save the greatest number. So for instance,